that this is socially fairer. The high tax rate is usually applied to luxury goods, or what politicians decree as being luxury goods, whilst lower tax rates are applied to other goods and services down to the total exemption from indirect taxation. This turns the rather simple system of indirect taxation into a complicated system which needs additional civil servants. This, of course, gives the politicians the possibility of employing their friends and fellow party members as civil servants. In addition, it gives politicians and parties unlimited possibilities to buy votes, not by handing out taxpayers' money, but rather through tax advantages. The influence of the state on the economy, and with it the influence of the politicians, is increased because the politician can now put this product or that service into this or that tax bracket. Because they consume more, lower taxation rates on certain products and services are usually much more in favor of the rich people than in favor of the poor people. The poor people from time to time also consume products or services which politicians have defined for unknown reasons as luxury goods. It costs the state and the taxpayer a significant amount of money without helping the poor people in society if the politicians pursue a social policy with different tax rates in indirect taxation. Anyone who wants to help the poor people in society must help them directly. If the authority for direct taxation lies with the local communities and for indirect taxation with the state, there are good social, political and economic reasons not only for a uniform tax rate but also for a rather high tax rate. Indirect taxation will then be the only instrument for a limited redistribution of income within a state between richer and poorer regions. A state whose responsibility is restricted only to foreign policy, the financing of the education system, and the maintenance of law and order needs less tax revenues. With higher revenues from indirect taxation, the state should be in a position to achieve substantial surpluses. Part of the surpluses will be needed to service the national debt and to repay it over a certain period of time. The state should also sell all state property, which is not needed for its main tasks anymore, in order to pay back the national debt as quickly as possible. The aim is a state without debts, so that the surpluses from indirect taxation can be distributed fully to the local communities according to the number of their inhabitants. These allocations per capita of the surplus revenues from indirect taxation should give the local communities the possibility of covering at least a part of their expenses. The rest has to be covered by direct taxation or other income. Such a division of the tax authority would have the major advantage that the local communities and the whole population within a state would have a very strong interest in the state behaving as economically as possible and not putting itself more into debt. Only then would the local communities and their population benefit from surpluses of indirect taxation. On the level of the local communities and with direct democracy, the population has a much better control over the use of the taxpayers' money than it does at state level. To prevent the state from financing its tasks through debt, it is important to introduce an article into the Constitution which makes it very difficult for the state to raise any loans. what has been achieved by the state of Liechtenstein, originally a very poor state without natural resources, but now without debts, should also be possible with a solid fiscal policy for other developed states. Neither should the state of the future give any guarantees to the local communities and association of communities. Only if a community can go bankrupt and its existence threatened, will the large majority of the voters support a long-term solid fiscal policy at the community level. The danger of bankruptcy will also force creditors to follow a prudent and responsible loan policy towards the communities. Up to now, in a number of states, companies and banks have sold exaggerated projects and loans to respected but inexperienced councillors, knowing that in the last resort the state will have to pay. A state without debt, with foreign policy, the financing of the education system, and the maintenance of law and order as its only duties, will again become a lean and transparent state which can be financed by a small percentage of the gross domestic product. The surplus from the revenues of indirect taxation would flow directly to the local communities, which would have in addition the authority for direct taxation. Those taxes would be on companies and individuals, real estate, dogs, cats, or whatever taxation a local politician can think of. In principle, a community could have the possibility of raising, in addition to the state, an indirect tax on certain products or services. To reduce consumption for health reasons, a community might put an additional tax on alcohol or tobacco. The financial subsidies of the state from indirect taxation and the tax authority over direct taxation should enable communities with even limited resources to finance at least a basic welfare system. It should be possible to reduce the financial burden of the pension system by raising the retirement age and by encouraging the increase of private pension systems. Nevertheless, this is very much dependent on the level of employment and economic development. Such a fundamental reorganization of the state should ease the financial burden on private business, give a new impetus to private consumption, accelerate the growth of the economy, and therefore increase the demand for additional labor. This would especially be the case for those local communities which structure direct taxation and social programs in such a way that it will be attractive for people to work and for companies to employ additional labor. The fear that between the different communities a race to the bottom for the lowest tax rate will start is unfounded. The example of Switzerland and Liechtenstein shows that different tax rates between communities lead only to a limited migration of companies and people from communities with higher tax rate to those with lower tax rate. For people and companies, tax rates are just one of many reasons why people and companies settle where they do. For companies, other reasons are more important, like the availability of a workforce, a well-developed infrastructure, or the proximity to markets. For most people, the tax rate is usually not the decisive reason for choosing where to live. Other reasons are more important, like the proximity of the workplace or good schools for the children. A community with high taxation and bad services will nevertheless lose people and companies in the longer term. The state of the future will give the people in their community much more freedom on how they want to shape the future for themselves and their descendants. There will be communities which will require higher taxation but will offer better service. Some communities might shape their services according to the needs of elderly people and others to the requirements of young families. Through taxation, social programs, school and transportation systems, cultural programs, building regulations, and the availability of building sites, etc., the communities in the state of the future will have considerable freedom to look for the best solution according to the wishes of their population and the possibilities of their geographical area. In a direct democracy, the citizen in a community will decide how attractive his or her community should be for people and companies. Will the state survive the third millennium? Yes. Will monarchies survive the third millennium? Yes. Will large centralized states survive the third millennium? Probably not. To handle the transition from large centralized states to small states or decentralized large states peacefully will be one of the big challenges now at the beginning of the third millennium. Thank you.
His Highness has gratefully accepted to take questions, and we have someone with a microphone. Laura Seaman will go around. If you would please be so kind as to raise your hand, and I can call on you. Yes. Okay.
Fascinating presentation, thank you. The questions on my mind are, if the new state is to be a service company, who owns it? And along with that, what do we do about the worldwide trend towards the concentration of wealth under this picture?
I think the concentration of wealth is to a certain degree also that there's not enough competition. If rich people have too much influence on the state administration and the politicians, they can restrict competition to a certain extent. And what I've seen in Liechtenstein, of course it's a very small example, but I've seen it also in other states, there is usually to liberalize an economy, to open the markets, there is usually a sort of vested interest which are against it. Once you open it, and if you adapt the state such a way that it's easier for small companies to start again, then I think you create a lot of wealth, and then the wealth again is distributed to a large extent. And that's at least what we have seen in Liechtenstein, where we have new companies coming on all the time by local people who create these companies, because we don't have much bureaucracy, very low taxation, and many of the rich people we have are first generation, second generation.
Other questions? Yes.
Thank you. The second, that fascinating presentation. I have a technical question. In your definitions of the state as a service company, you have mentioned healthcare. I wonder what you think about that. Is that a totally private service, or is this something that is included in the service of the state as a service company?
I mentioned what?
Healthcare.
Healthcare, yes. Healthcare, I think you can do it, well, first of all, I think it's a good idea to have it firstly on a private basis, basically that private insurance companies, that you have private insurance on that. But of course, many people cannot afford it anymore if they're out of jobs or